متمغبة خاجر خيتابي تايبا غموخون جبت فاتوخون دخت بغزايتون رابا رابا مغبة ميقرا في راس جاتو وبز اتلان ارخا رابا رابا مغبة قد اخنا نشيدو قد اتي خكمة اتن هم زمانه قد امس مبرم ككلن ميقرا مايكل يوش قد منن الى السكايب ادي خكمة هم زمان اتن قد انا بخشابن بساسه يو خشلامه داريتون اخنوخن ابن امتن قد اخورز شارخله
بسيم رابن قرانينوس شلامه لخن رب شوخن طاوه خزيان مخبه مثلا هيوي قد اخورز هاوي منطقه منهرتا قاتوخن باسط ان اهولت قومنا جو لخ وطرة امريكا باسط ابن امتن جو اطرا
احنا لخ بشماي واخكما legislations بتاعنا جو واشنطن دي سي وبشماي واجو خباره كانت خكمه legislation دون باس فايا كانت لخ بدايه اصلا ان لخ بدايه امتى لخ بدايه ان legislations مودي اينا منايه مودي الى وميك شورينا قد اتي قد اخنا لخ بدايه الدم جيبه برشنا اينا هيرانك امتانيا اينا بوش مجتاني اجزانك امتان بغزاي خكمه دونات برش دكتور خا درمانا يابانيله كات دزويتا بقطالانيله او درمانا ليله سواي درمانا ايتا لاكت كل خا درمانا الى درمانا كات باسملان انا اديا ازخ من ميقرا مايكل يوش لا بقرا كات شولو اها الى اكسبرت الى جداها خقله كات امس مبرم ككلن كات ميكا اها ميقرا مايكل ان ممكن الى خدشة كديان مدت اها legislation كد تيتلا و الله همزومه باخ ميكا شوريت لا مودي الى اصلا منايو مودي الى
بسيم رابا ميقرانينوس ميقرا فراس بسيم رابا قاين بيسات قدا برست رمشوخن داوم كل جشقانم خزيانة مغبة وبين طلبا بخاطئين بين أمنا خامدي بس جواب دي دازي be English because some of the concepts, some of the issues we're dealing with are very complicated, and I'm going to try to simplify them, and it's only going to be easier for me to do it in English. So before you even move into House Concurrent Resolution 75, which is being labeled the Genocide Recognition Resolution that people are discussing today and debating today, first let me tell everybody about American legislation and how to understand the categories of it. So in terms of legislation, there's something called a bill. And a bill, what defines a bill or what makes a bill separate from a resolution is that when a bill is passed, it's very simple. It goes to the president for action. This is Congress's rules, the Constitution. A bill, when passed, goes to the president for action. Now, what separates a bill from a resolution is that whether it's a resolution or a concurrent resolution, meaning the House of Representatives and the Senate, when resolutions are passed, by definition, they do not go to the president for action. So these resolutions are an expression or a sense of Congress, meaning Congress is giving an opinion, but there's no action that stems forth legally from it. Now, the other two things that people should understand in the legislative environment is the difference between authorizations and appropriations. So the Assyrian community in America today is hearing announcements and has heard announcements in the past, for years actually, about authorizations. An authorization is a piece of legislation from a committee. Let's say the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs writes the authorization for the Department of State. And that authorization expresses the intention of Congress. But after that, after the authorization stage, the second stage is called an appropriation. There's a separate committee that is the Appropriations Committee that takes the intention of the authorization and adds money to it, meaning it puts meat on the bones. Now, the problem is you can sometimes have an authorization and not get an appropriation, at which point you really have nothing. or you have something much weaker than what you thought you were doing. So you have to kind of succeed at both stages. From an authorization, you need the appropriation. So once again, a bill goes to the president for action. Resolutions in writing do not go to the president for action. They simply express the sense of Congress, and then there's authorizations and appropriations. So that's the general landscape of legislation.
نيوت لبساسة منايو خيلا قد اي authorization إلى أخشي يقول لبساسة قد إن اي صيتا خيتا اي كميدي خيتا separate خبرشتا صيتا بيا او دغ وادا خشولة مصيا لنا بكلايو دار قولو إلى اي يقول نبساسة authorization يقرأ مايكل هر همزمتن ايت resolution هل بات اي ان بي سات رابو بشمالة من ناشا بريشة من شوتاسة قطوصة شوتاسة دين لخا جو سان هوزي وجو اريزونا ودكان خينا خكما تخمنيات بريشة باست resolution 75 ماست يود خمان هارتا باست مودينا أن concerns resolution 75
Masen open up this subject to Hemzimin Baso itindraba nugze ina bas ubain amran firas ubatin itlugraba takhmaniyat al-daqisat, a lot of experience and wisdom to bring to it. But let me first explain. So in September there was a conference held, a huge conference held in Washington D.C. Led by an entity called In Defense of Christians. It was the Christian Summit, Christians of the Middle East Summit. And during that summit, Congressman Fortenberry from Nebraska tabled a resolution, House Concurrent Resolution 75, so it's going to be in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, pushing for recognition of genocide. Now, that resolution, which from now on we can just call Resolution 75, has some serious problems from the perspective of the Assyrian American community for the Assyrians in the Middle East and our people in the Middle East. So the first one is, this resolution, Raba Baqarala, Raba Mazyud al-Shorpa Audanit, and the work of the Kurdistan region of Iraq and the Kurdistan regional government and the Peshmerga. Now, the problem with that elevation and that praise of the Kurdistan region of Iraq and the Peshmerga is that in terms of ISIS's assault, Daesh's assault on the Nineveh plains, approximately 2 weeks, the exact dates kind of spread out in terms of where these notices were given, but several weeks before ISIS attacked, through a security authorization, through an order by the Peshmerga and the security forces in the Nineveh plains, which were under the control of the Kurdistan regional government, they disarmed everybody in the Nineveh plains. They disarmed our people. So weeks before ISIS attacked, we were disarmed by the Peshmerga. And then after that, on the evening that the assault came from ISIS, the Peshmerga abandoned us completely. In fact, all the security forces under the control of the KRG that had for years said they are there for our protection, abandoned us. So from the perspective of the Christian Assyrian community, this goes more than complicity of the KRG, even into culpability of the successful ethnic cleansing of the Nineveh plains. So it becomes difficult as people who care about the Assyrian cause and the truth to accept this language that elevates and praises and builds a pro-Kurdish nationalist agenda, when in fact there's serious evidence to their complicity in the successful ethnic cleansing from Dasht Nineveh. Following on that, one of the major problems with the resolution is that the entire resolution clearly reads as a narrative, as a legislative narrative, building on the legitimacy and elevation of Kurdistan. So, and that's fine. The lobbies that work for the Kurdish nationalist, organized Kurdish nationalist interests are within their rights and have every justification to pursue their interests. But Assyrians have the right to pursue our interests, and we also have the right to pursue our interests when our interests are being undermined for the sake of others. In this case, clearly what's happening under House Resolution 75 is an organized Kurdish nationalist interest agenda is being pushed at our expense. So one clear example, I'm just giving an example from the wording in the resolution. I mean, it refers to the IDPs that are now in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, currently sitting in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, returning to Iraq. Well, the Kurdistan region of Iraq, by definition, is part of Iraq. So somehow, how is Kurdistan separated from Iraq already? But by this legislation, it reads with that positive narrative, elevating Kurdistan to the level of nations with Jordan and Lebanon. In addition to that, all various ethnic groups are recognized in this. Even Kurds, a genocide against the Kurds is recognized in Resolution 75, but Assyrians are only circumscribed to the category of Christians. Now, the problem with this is that we know that part of what makes this a genocide is the cultural genocide. So the destruction of ancient artifacts, cultural artifacts that are part of ancient Assyrian civilization. There are lots of, we do have divisions within our community. There are nomenclature issues about our community. But when people are reporting the destruction of the gates of the ancient city of Nineveh, there's no equivocation, there's no doubt on this. It's a cultural genocide against Assyrians. So Assyrians are left out of the equation. And finally, let me say that for a resolution that pushes genocide recognition, there's a glaring omission in terms of solutions. And the solutions that Assyrians need to see within this resolution need to reflect that our independent, local, legitimate security and humanitarian organizations need to be part of an overall solution to our crisis. And that's simply because the Assyrians in the area do no longer trust anybody else to protect them and work for them but themselves.
Michael, لك بغزاي وقت تريش بيات من قم داش اتيابا اتاك ودابا الجبانة نينوى بلينز اخنا كلهم بياش بق آجوب قد داخي بشمرجة تريش بات من قم دانا ديس ارم وادلا أنا ملتت قد جو نينوى بلين إلى خامندي ربا ماجوبانتا قد دي قد داخي تريش بات من قم داش اتيا من جيبت ارم قد ينفي تازا ارم كلش قلالون نيدان يعني كمت اتفعلا جاك كده من ايدت ناشد جو نينوى بلين اتفاش قلالون اذا تداش تيلا قد ورا تاما جاني تفلون جو أطنابيله ورقلون خشلون يعني شفكلون ملة ديان وبيا بتانخ كتخد بخايل يزيدية تركمان أطراي كل بيشلون هرات خا لب بروتكشن لب خا جكا بيده إن عادية ريزولوشن دولا بيتايا برموية وخ خكما problems اتن مدار ريزولوشن إن أخنا أخ برناشا أخ ناشد رابا تانخ ياداي ناشي لخ برموية ليلا بوس باي at least resolution قد بيتايلا و بود genocide ديان همزوملا أقلا we have this مجيكتاني legislation resolution قد أتيا باس أويا بود genocide بوس بايلا أفيلان ين لافيلان أي خينا خابو خارا بايلا.
Yeah, so Mikraninos, you used a metaphor at the start of this segment, at the start of this show, saying, you know, if somebody's sick, you don't just accept any medication. And I would say, you know, this question is often asked. It's a general question. Isn't some legislation better than no legislation? Isn't this resolution better than no resolution? And I would actually just restate the metaphor that you gave. In Khadana Muryale, if somebody's sick, you're not going to raid a pharmacy or raid your medicine cabinet and simply start taking pills. You can kill yourself. You can make yourself more sick. So I think there are three general ways that I want to answer this question. The first thing to understand about whether any legislation is better than no legislation, and this resolution is better than no resolution, is to say, look, let's first understand that all legislation is political. It's politics. Legislation by definition cannot be without politics, without an agenda. So anyone who is telling you that, oh, we are pushing legislation, we are pushing policies that are for everybody, that are for all people, that are for all factions within the community, that we don't work for one group, we work for all groups, is actually lying to the community. They're either lying to themselves or lying to the community. So, I mean, let me use a simple example. Obamacare, to the American audience. Obamacare wasn't it represents a certain segment's thinking. It represents a certain faction's thinking. It's not without politics. It's very political. And same with in 2012, when the Assyrian community, in 2011 and 2010, when we were pushing at that time what was called the Nineveh Plains Province solution. The focus, the centerpiece of that policy was Article 125. We made it very clear. And that immediately represented a certain political idea, a certain agenda, and situated us within that political spectrum. Another example that legislation is political and that we need to look at it with a political eye is now, apart from Resolution 75, there's another resolution, House Resolution 440, proposed by Congressman Trott. And that resolution very clearly gives pride of place to MFS. The MFS in Syria, which at its core has a segment that is a group called the Doronoye. Now the Doronoye have decided to work within the Syriac Union Party, within the Kurdish cantonal governments and parties, which is the PYD. And that canton government under Kurdish autonomy has passed legislation that is basically land theft of Assyrian lands. They've assassinated Assyrians. They've stopped any effort at political independence by Assyrians. And they've tried to remove any effort by Assyrians to maintain their autonomy, their decisional autonomy. They want to control us politically. So House Resolution 440 is political. The language of it is political. So we need to look at it in that way. So Resolution 75 is also political. Right now, there's an agenda to have the White House, President Obama has indicated that he's considering or may issue a statement about genocide against the Yazidis, and the Christian Assyrian community is mobilizing to get the White House and President Obama to include Christians, if not Assyrians, within this designation. Now, within the advocacy community in Washington, D.C., dozens of American organizations have issued letters. Very few, there's only a small number of Assyrian organizations within these letters, but these letters, for example, one of them with In Defense of Christians, Wilberforce, and others, all signatories to these are purely American organizations. Their letter specifically says, White House say genocide for Christians. They link it to House Resolution 75, and the idea is that this would instigate a process that would require action on the ground, and of course that means a safe haven. But because of the way House Concurrent Resolution 75 is framed, what you can see is an agenda that says a safe haven via Peshmerga entering into Dasht Ninweh. So in the name of liberation and the establishment of safe haven, we see an agenda that's basically the conquest of Dasht Ninweh, in the name of liberation and the establishment of safe haven. That's the trajectory that we're seeing. That's what's being laid bare in front of us for those who are tracking these developments. So that's the first part of the answer, is why some legislation is saying some legislation is better than no legislation is an irresponsible position. We have to be very critical of what kind of legislation is being proposed and understand that it's political, not apolitical. The second is that lobbying is inherently not principled, because when you're lobbying, you're pushing for legislation, it requires compromise. So I'll give you an example. The National Defense Authorization Act from 2015 said, local security forces, even in the Nineveh Plains, need to be pushed. That legislation, as proposed, would require forces to receive funding through others. So for example, through Baghdad or through the Kurdistan regional government. Well, we have a history of being exploited through that means. The indirect support actually leads to our subjugation and dependency. So therein, again, is a political agenda. The only principled position that our advocacy organizations and our lobbyist organizations should have is that whatever legislation is being pushed, whatever form it's being pushed or policies are being pushed, it has to go directly to Assyrians and directly to other vulnerable people through their independent and legitimate organizations. But no lobbyist, no advocacy organization is pushing this position today, or at least those that are permanently in Washington, D.C. from our community. And there's two reasons for that. One, it's in terms of Washington, D.C. language, this is called a heavy lift. It's a heavy piece of legislation to lift. the likelihood of it passing is much lower because you're being much more aggressive and much more ambitious. So for somebody who wants to keep reporting success with their legislative efforts, with their lobbying efforts, what you do is you lower the bar very, very low. Instead of pushing for what your nation actually needs, you push for something for what your performance targets needs. So you lower the bar very low to say, oh, well, let's just keep it general and vague, even if it allows others to exploit us by passing this legislation. But you get to say, we passed legislation. A lobbyist can say, we passed this legislation, we were successful. The other part of it is, by saying we have this principled position of being dealt with directly and aid and support reaching us through independent and legitimate organizations, is that right away you're taking a side. You're taking the side of the independents, or those people, those Assyrian organizations in Iraq and Syria who can make decisions for themselves and not be told what to think and told what to do. Well, right away, you're going to create opposition and create tension with some of our oppressors. In this case, I would be, for example, the Kurdistan regional government, which has invested heavily in creating organizations that answer to it, but in the name of Assyrians, Chaldeans, Syriacs, or Iraqi Christians. So I can actually give you an example, real time, of what's happening in Washington, D.C. today to show you what I mean. There are two pieces of legislation that are coming out very soon. The way that it works is from committees, from the appropriations committees. Remember I said about appropriations, they're the one who put the money onto the authorization. So there are two pieces of appropriations legislations. One's from the House of Representatives, the other is from the Senate, that are coming down soon. They might be changed, they might be dropped, because the House and the Senate have to come together and reconcile their different language. But if you'll allow me, I'd like to read you the language that's coming down. So on the House appropriation side, there's a piece of legislation coming that might be announced next week. It says, the committee in addition, the Secretary should work with the government of Iraq to ensure that the assistance and security needs of other ethnic and religious minority communities are met. And then it goes on to say, the committee recommendation includes language in section 7041C of this act, making assistance available for Iraq to promote governance, security, and internal and regional stability, including in Kurdistan and other areas impacted by conflict and among Iraq's religious and ethnic minority communities. The committee also expects funds be made available in this title to enhance the security of Iraq's religious and ethnic minority populations, including Christians, that have been adversely affected by the conflict. On the Senate side, the language that's coming says, the committee continues to support programs to assist vulnerable Iraqi ethnic and religious minorities, including the Christian community, particularly in the Nineveh Plains, from funds appropriated by the Act for Assistance for Iraq. So here are two pieces of legislation. They've been happening since June or July of this year, and they might be announced next week or this week. And this language is nothing different from the language that Assyrians, activists, and lobby organizations have been pushing since 2005. And all of our lessons learned from this experience is that this is the exact language that increases our dependency and increases our vulnerability and has only made us weaker in the face of our enemies. Because this open language, remember I said the bar is set very low? Because it doesn't say direct assistance to independent and legitimate organizations, the funding goes through the KRG, the funding goes through, well, at that time through Mosul, Muhafada, Nainawa, and others, and these people exploit us, exploit our vulnerability to increase our dependency, and sometimes the money just doesn't reach us, it just gets stolen before it arrives. This happened, for example, with the Iraq Sustainable Democracy Project, the Syrian American National Coalition, and a host of other organizations that lobbied and advocated and did activist work for years and years. Between 2008 and 2011, Assyrian Americans, through all this activity, had managed to appropriate $42 million to the vulnerable people of the Nineveh Plains. And to this day, all we can say is that it empowered, more than anything else, it empowered the Kurdistan regional government to exploit our vulnerability and to diminish our political independence, our security independence, and to pursue what is in the Assyrian national interest. So, I can actually tell you one last point about why this is such a problem to think some legislation is better than no legislation. ISDP and basically all this Assyrian activism stopped at the end of 2011. We passed legislation for 2012, and at that point we completely stopped. In 2013, when there were no Assyrians, no Iraqi Christians doing advocacy work deliberately in a focused way in Washington, D.C., more legislation was passed with no one doing anything. No one lifted a finger. No one in a Muslim qanun qatan. In 2014, so you do the work in 2012 to get the language in 2013, there was nobody there, we got legislation. That's how easy it is. In 2013, when you're doing legislation for 2014, more legislation was passed when nobody was there. In fact, nobody was working in Washington, D.C. at all when the Senate passed language calling for the creation or American support for the creation of the Nineveh Plains province. The final point that I want to make about no legislation is bad, some legislation is better, is this lobby and advocacy industry, especially within our community, has one unfortunate side effect. What I learned this firsthand, and Mikro Firaz Jettu was a board member and a founder of the Iraq Sustainable Democracy Project, among some other remarkable, very good Umtanai, very good Assyrians. We found that the more successful we were and the more work we did, the quieter, in terms of activism, Assyrian Americans became. And what happens is this worrying pattern where when people see somebody, we say we have someone in Washington, D.C., somebody's working. And what scares me today is that what we're seeing is a new trend. So today it's a trend of Assyrian activism as tweeting, sharing, liking, accepting. No, this is unacceptable. You Assyrians, somebody, you need to get up and go to your representative, speak to your representative, make your demands directly. It's not for someone in Washington to make your demands. Every one of us has a responsibility and a right to go and make this demand. And it scares me when I see that the activism that is being encouraged on the one hand is all in social media today, and what's actually happening in terms of lobbying and activism in Washington, D.C. is being done behind closed doors. When we used to work before, when we used to do this work from 2005 to 2011, all of our policy materials, all of our documents, everything we were pursuing was detailed in reports online. We empowered our activists to fully understand what was being requested in Washington, D.C. So you had the activism from the members, but you also had the activists fully understanding what was being done and requested in the meetings in Washington, D.C. Today, all the activism is on social media, tweet, like, share. But what's happening in Washington, D.C. by lobbyists and activists is happening behind closed doors with no one knowing what is actually being requested and asked. So this is how I think you arrive at poorly developed and actually harmful language within a resolution that is well intended. Finally, I think I'm heartened by something that I'm seeing happening. There seems to be a grassroots rebuking of this, or the emergence. I'm being contacted by activists around the US and Europe, the voice of free Assyrians. And this kind of idea that we can bring the whole picture to Washington, D.C., that activists individually need to be empowered and mobilized with their representatives can hopefully fix things, like House Concurrent Resolution 75, by bringing the whole picture to Washington, D.C.
بس مرابم رمايكل بخشاون رابا نغزم متخرخ مني قمايا أختي هر نغزت ميرالا ميرانينوس قد لكو الدرمانا سباي لقاتن بخشاون بني أمتن هما شوينا صيانا طب نيوز ين legislation تهاوي باسن بخزانا أمتن وارا لقو أن أهولت تشقي قو مدنخا وهش خلالها همزو ما باسو الراتن مسبق له أخشليه ما تخريش من بخزانا خل legislation ما تخورنا خمن دي باسن أوبن هويا شماليلا ما تخورو مرا مشيخاية راو بخداينا همزوم أنا باسم قال صندخ له من دي ولا أنا بقرايا كلها the fine print ما خمر بإنجليز متخرخ أنا نغزة منهار ترابا أنا نقيتها لقبنا يوم تنجاك يا طيلة أخشي باين قديمائيت أمرنو أنا نغزة متخرخ قد أنا كترة أنا problems إيتن قاو من دي قمايا أمت أطرايا يعني كريستيانا مارنا بلخا مزيودنا أوب قرداية مارنا قد أني إنا victims اتقتل أما الجينوسايد جو آدكتا أبن يطخ وأبقو طب قرداية مخزوينة قد إمايت هدامت آيسس إينا قرداية سو داخي وقتل أمت قرداية ليتن خد genocide against people against قرداية جو كتوياتا ات آيسس مارنا قد قتل infidels أخ كريستيانا أخ يزيديز أخ شبك وخينة وهداية و other infidels لنا مدخورة قرداية so ISIS لنا مارا قرداية بقانو مخزونة جو تي في دي جو قرداية إنا هدامت بدواقونا قد وارنا جو كردستان so اتمدخلت داني victims بدزوتا ليلة شرارة يعني open hitch دار قلوتا لتلا من قرداية متيتو قد إنا victims ليلة شرارة دخ ما صخصان دخلت من دي ليلة دوس من دي تريمت خرو قد رابا براشونا كردستان regional government يعني distinguish وادونا قد رابا هيورنا أو من دي ليلة دوس سبب أب أطروات خضروانة ننوى أب أني قبيلنا رابا توتاوى ين مشخطة إن إلى جوردن 50,000 إيتن أطراية تاما لبنان العراق رابا الشبك إن الشيعيتس رقلوا من دشتة نوا خشلوا قصدرن العراق وبأن شقيلنا خكمة مشخطة ين توتاوى تركي وأطروات خينا خشميلي أبقوا جورجستان إيتن هيتش خلينا مدخورو جو ريزولوشن أخشي مدخورنا قرداية يعني إدخا بريشوتا ولا نقاطة ليلة فير من دي الاطلاق متخرخ البت خدش مزيودا خك ما نغزة باسط أنا إلى أية مرخ معنا قد هاوي خيومة قد ضيري أنك إيراك أوكي يعني إيه ريزولوشن معنا قد كردستان ريجن ليلة خسامة إيراك أي ليلة دوس دزوتا يعني أخنا بني أمن أن خزيانا مخبة كشيروتا ديان كيك أو دخلة أكتيفيزم إلى أن نغزق بارميتو إنه ومضيتم كرابريزنتيف ديوخون لتلن دار قلوتها من قرداية ليه بيخر بايوتا قدنا وباني برناشينا أخشي أول من دي ليلة دوس ليلة شرارة وليلة فير أوكي أنا من ديانا ريزولوشن خشون ومايكل لتسس جورا يعني باوتا همرتلا سنادوخ أخشي أنا شخلابة جيك آتي الإيتوتا amendments جيك هاو الإيتوتا لخ در قولو نقزة ديو إسا ديو نيشو طاوة لأخشي مزيتا إلى إتلا بلاطة ما سيئة هوية خخوز داقة أن بصريات خيط minorities أنا نغزة متخرخ أنا كتيوالي distinguishing them من أطروات خينا بريشوتا من العراق مدخورا أخ كريستيانا بخلطة لنا مدخورا أخ أطراية وقد آني إنا victims إيتن كترا خينا اتلت هم زما باسود بخزايت جو أقصت
so بينما قدا قصة لا بس resolution 75 إن قصة what this resolution is a part of really what I'm worried about that I want to make everyone understand that's watching is that it is a mistake to reduce the Assyrian cause and the Assyrian crisis to Daesh, to ISIS. I mean, let me tell you on one basic level, and Firas, you were, as a founder of Iraq Sustainable Democracy Project, we started working in 2005. The ethnic cleansing, the targeting, and the raw violence against our people in Baghdad since 2005 was on a phenomenal scale. And in fact, if we're going to secure genocide recognition, it shouldn't be from June 2014. It should be from 2005. The case for genocide is built since that time, at least since 2005. It's about 10 years of genocide, of genocidal violence, not since ISIS. But for the Assyrians to reduce our entire crisis to the moment to ISIS is actually short-sighted. It's a mistake. I want to say the Assyrian cause, our cause, existed before ISIS. We have major problems. Now, let's look at our neighbors. Qurdaya, Almat Qurdaya, Almat Arabaya, at Turkaya, at Ma'win. Not one of these peoples, as governments or as states or as authorities or as nations, not one of them is 100% reducing all of their struggle to fighting ISIS. But why are Assyrians doing that? Why are Assyrians forgetting the entire cause to ISIS? The reality for us, in my evaluation, is in terms of our modern history, okay? Turkish nationalism, Arab nationalism, Kurdish nationalism, especially as they push towards statehood, as this resolution shows. If we think about our body and our nation in terms of health, sometimes the nationalism of these people has driven actions by them that are like a cancer to us. They're killing us in the way that a cancer kills people. Now, ISIS is like Ebola. ISIS is this flash that's hitting us. It's severe, it's devastating, but it's a flash emergency. It's also a medical emergency. Now, somebody with cancer and in an Ebola zone doesn't stop treating themselves and dealing and fighting with cancer simply because there's Ebola in their vicinity or there's an Ebola outbreak. They combat both. But us, it seems that we're being asked and we're being driven by others. We're the nation. While nobody else is doing it, we're the ones who have to stop and only dedicate ourselves and our attention to ISIS and understand that our other problems, such as Kurdish nationalist agendas towards us, should be set aside for now. This is a disastrous mistake. I want to say that in diaspora, آتورای خارج يعني آتورای بخاية جو أمريكا جو كندا جو Europe جو Australia إيك أوغ. We need to understand that we have to speak out about oppression against Assyrians in Assyria at all times and in all forms. All types of oppression against us have to be named and addressed and tackled, especially by Assyrians in diaspora who are free to do this. We need to understand that religion makes us an easy target. Our ethnicity makes us a complicated target. But we are targeted in both ways, and we must address it in both ways. Our enemies benefit when we only focus on one at the expense of the other. And this resolution is a small example of that outcome.
لك أخنا مايكل بغزاي وقت خا أخ ويا خا أخ فيلم دون دايركتور إتن لخ خا من دي إتن بغزاي وقت رابا من ديانا بيتاينا كل ستارز بكلاينا كز ويدال بخا بصلقت خاناشة دولة أنا دايركت وعدالة بغزاي وقت مجرى داعش بيتايلا أدي داعش بغزايخ أدي ميقرا فراز دولة تيبا دبني بغزاي وقت كلان ميقرا فرازي له إن أدي بالت خدانا كسيتا كمتا ما تبريش وآتلا خليطخ مايله أبتانا أنا إيمن داعش بغزايخ داعش بيتايلا terrorize وادولا كل region وكل أنا من ديانا واديلا خارتا beneficiary لخمويلا بياينا region قد إيلا كردستان بياينا بوش جاك خلان شكلي قد أمسي كالي وكم لا كثرت كالي كم داعش بي كالي كم بغداد جانو وآها ريزولوشن أنا بخشابن أصلا لم بدا يماني آها ريزولوشن ما يولي بدا بصلة قد ينده بصلة خسروتها بيانا آبخ allies قد بدا بصلة أخلا أزخ يرخ قد آها ريزولوشن باس أويا قد أمسي بوش يقوير مجك تاني جكة قد أمسي شكلي قد أمسي كالي جباتت بغداد ماني بخشابت بردا ريزولوشن إلى قد ميونا متونا تعمقت أزا باسويا.
Well, okay. خامن دي ناشي قلت برمي only members of Congress خهدامة مجلس ين مجلس النواب ين مجلس الشيوخ ماس مصلقة. So the simple answer to your question is who's behind this is members of Congress, specifically one who has proposed this resolution. I know I've met and worked with Congressman Fortenberry, who proposed this specific resolution, and I can tell you, he's a wonderful person. He cares very much. This is a cause that touches him deeply. I know it does. I know Congressman Fortenberry cares about this, and I know the resolution means well. But the problem is, even the best of congressmen, don't truly understand our issue, don't truly understand the complexity of our needs and our political situation and our struggle. So they're ignorant. A lot of them are ignorant, even if they're well-meaning. What makes the problem worse is when they're receiving bad information, or for example, half of the picture. So in my previous answer earlier, I was explaining how we focus on one struggle and we forget about the other issues. Well, the groups that are working and advocating in Washington, D.C. full-time are saying it's all about ISIS. So you almost can't blame Congressman Fortenberry for saying it's all about ISIS, because he's not hearing about the other part of the picture, the other part of our struggle. Now, if you'll allow me, I'm sorry, but there's something else that's very important that I'm observing as I track what's happening here. Our cause, the Assyrian cause, is being overrun today by non-Assyrian, non-Iraqi Christian groups and entities. أمريكاية يعني مناي إلى أطراية أمريكا أمريكاينا إلى non-Assyrian Americans. أمريكاية أصلاية are really behind this. So for example, the letter I referred to that links genocide recognition to House Concurrent Resolution 75, there's really only a couple Assyrian or Iraqi Christian or Middle Eastern Christian signatories, and there's almost a dozen more, or almost 20 other organizations that are purely American. What's happened is that our cause has been overrun by others. And so the question becomes, I mean, as Assyrians with a cause, we try to attract support to our cause, as opposed to, and that's dying, or that seems to have become very weak in Washington, D.C. Our cause, attracting foreign support, is no longer the case. It's a cause being driven by non-Assyrians, and we seem to be clamoring to hang on to it. This terrifies me. This terrifies me. And I really believe that the proof of what I'm saying is Resolution 75 itself. I can't believe that an Assyrian, an Umtanaya, wrote this resolution. Certainly not the parts that Muqra Firas explained are clearly anti-Assyrian or anti-Umta, even our case as Christians, as Iraqi Christians. So I don't believe, the proof is, of what I'm saying, is that I don't believe any of these groups had written this. But the situation is still scary because there are groups that are signing on to it, Assyrian groups or Iraqi Christian groups that seem to be comfortable latching on to non-Assyrians now driving our agenda.
Mr. Michael, قد بتايلا legislation قد بتايلا توم propose وايلا وقتها احنا اتلان جو Washington DC any kind of lobbyist قد almost آمن دي قامت الدايجست أفد لجانو وخرطة مبرملة ناشديا وخرطة قد أمسخ أزغ لقامة بيو ين لا أزغ لقامة بيو تخمن تخمي لبداية احنا اتلان خا مجك يعني power vacuum جو كم سختانا جو واشنطن دي سي اتلان لوبيست ين مودي تخموننا اني
اتن رابا اتن خشمة أبلغ بضايا باسه so مودي مارا أي قصة الدين قصة مشيخاية مدنخا خرطة آتوراي أخنا نجاشوق تخمونخ أمتناي آتوراي the Assyrian cause in Washington D.C. Today, there's more lobbyists and more organizations working on this issue than there have ever been in the past. So there are numerous groups there that say that they're pushing this cause, that say that this is their work and that this is their focus, including Assyrian Americans who are serving as lobbyists and advocates in Washington, D.C. So there isn't a power vacuum. The problem is, all the issues I discussed before this is that they're actually working in a flawed model. So I'm not going to reiterate all the problems, all the concerns that I've raised, but just to say almost all of them that I can see are guilty or suffering from the structural and policy problems that I've described, every one of them. And that's what's producing bad legislation, legislation that actually hurts our cause. And so let me just say, the answer to the question that I want to give, the answer to your question that I really want people to hear is not about who's there and who's working. They have every right to go and do what they're doing. There are two things that كل جشقانة قرت تخمني وقرت برسي وبتواته من خرواته and in Assyrian social circles. And it goes to what Muqra Firas said. We have to act. Lobbying and advocacy in Washington, D.C. has only, up to this day, hurt us. We've shown this and we've learned this since 2005. We've only suffered for it. In fact, all we've done is pass legislation that has empowered our enemies to oppress us. So, for example, I said the $42 million that was passed, most of that money was channeled through agencies like the Kurdistan Regional Government or agencies tied to the Kurdistan Regional Government who actually oppressed us through economic dependency and hurt our national cause and our national interests with the legislation that we passed. We had to learn this lesson, and we stopped because of it. We stopped because we couldn't change this structural problem. Today, there are lobbyists, activists pushing bad legislation, pushing these types of issues, but they're not being held accountable. So all Assyrian activists who care about their people, who care about their cause, who care about the results in the homeland, need to do two things. First, go and speak directly to your representative and take the whole picture to them. That's why I'm so happy to hear that there's these activists moving, like the voice of free Assyrians, bringing the full picture to Washington, D.C. And I hope it grows because it gives me hope. But at the same time, what you can do is hold these organizations accountable. Those who are working. So who has signed Resolution 75? We should ask those organizations that have signed on to Resolution 75 to explain themselves, to answer the issues that Muqra Firas brought up. We should put all of these to them as questions and say, now, given this, are we wrong? Is Muqra Firas wrong? Is Michael wrong? Is the community Shotopuyat in California, Hell, Michigan, Hell, Arizona, and Illinois are protesting this? Organizations Shotopuyat and activists, are we all wrong? Maybe these organizations that have signed on to it see something and are thinking about something strategic that we don't know. It should be a dialogue. But they should have to answer for their support for this resolution that we think is actually hurting our cause. So, let me just say, finally, you need to go to your representative with our message, with the full picture. That's basically what's missing right now. That's the vacuum, is everyone at home, sitting at home and not going directly to their representative.
Okay. Michael Basima Rabaq ay تخمنتوخ هلبت رابا يطرانا يوقعتنا وبقى خزيارا
يعني technically برمو يوخ resolution مويلة لا أكيد بهمزمتها يعني شابيرة مبرومو لقد
رابدوس ماست منهارت خدشبوزو ده باست ريشتوخ آتن باست ايمان هارتا داخل ريشتوخ باست ايمان هارتا تيولد تشمانا.
رابا بغداين قد أبرست قد ANB يولى أي برنامج is very important. The bridge to Nineveh on ANB SAT. It's a service to the community, and I'm happy to do what I'm doing in terms of providing this knowledge. And I hope it stimulates a debate. All I want to do is empower people to ask questions and understand what's going on. But I want to say that أنا رابط بشامن قد مجبور إلى قد أودخ برنامج أدخل خ program أدخل خ show أدخل and that I need to come out and do this deliver this kind of understanding. And the reason why I say that, why I regret that, is because in the past, and by here I mean, for example, when Iraq's Sustainable Democracy Project was working, when Assyrian American National Coalition as a lobbyist organization was working, and other organizations were working, What we did at that time, what the Assyrian activist community that was active in Washington, D.C. did is, as I said earlier, is all information, all policies were detailed, published, made public, and activists were empowered so that they would understand what was going on. I just want to echo today that I'm terrified that this isn't happening today. I'm terrified that we don't know what is specifically being pushed in Washington, D.C. today. So, I mean, for example, the one that strikes me the most is everybody is saying safe haven. Of course, everyone supports a safe haven. All the political groups in Iraq have signed documents saying we want a safe haven. Now, it's okay for someone in the public. The general public, that's fine. But when you're a lobbyist, when you're an activist, and you say safe haven, we are pushing a safe haven, that's not okay. You now need to get specific and start explaining what you mean. You should start publishing in detail what it is that your vision, that your policy is, so that people can understand it. And this is not happening today. And that's again why I think Resolution 75 is not only problematic the way it's currently worded, but it reflects a deeper problem in the Assyrian community's activism. It's actually, we're resulting in a situation where resolutions are being passed that look less like their support for our community and more for a Peshmerga conquest of the Nineveh plains.
ميغروماكل اخنا اخ امتا يعني قد اوجرت قد برموي وخ موديوار لخضروانا كلن اخا بصلا سوزجر وقت سزجر اخ من سيف هيفن ادي لك مبرومو بتقديان قد ليلة اخشي بس سيف هيفن بدو بصلت قد برموي وخ اتن خكمة من ديانت قد جري ابخ اخنا بدراشة قلداها سيف هيفن مود سيف هيفن ومود بصلا اخنا جري شقلخلا أنا بخشابن رابا من ناشديا أختي رابا خدينا كد أوكي إحنا نطلبق سيف هيفن وكلن خبرا قائلة قداها إتن خد دبيت لخا كد أنصخ الله ميخ على أيام بي بوزودا مبرمتا بالويدالة.
Sure, Pachalta. So I started another subject, but it is related to this bigger problem in our legislative agenda. So. Of course, saying safe haven is fine. And as I said, كل جبج وأطرا ميرنا بايخ safe haven. كشتيونا رشمايا البويانة بايخ safe haven. كل جبج. When you're a lobbyist, when you're an activist, it is your responsibility to be more specific because think about it. I'll use a different metaphor, not like a doctor and a sick body. When you go into a car dealership, and you say to a salesman, I need a car. You're not going to go into a car dealership and say, you need a car, and just take whatever car is brought out to you, is rolled into the front for you. Quite reasonably, the salesman is going to say, what kind of car do you need? For what purposes do you need? How much distances? Where is this car going to take you? What are you going to do with it? You need to start getting specific. Safe haven is like saying car, and then getting into the detail of it is actually going and selecting a car. And so when it comes to a safe haven, people need to understand something. The history of safe havens is not a happy history. Let's look at some of the four significant safe havens at the start of this pattern by international humanitarian security responses. So it's 1991, the Kurdistan region, okay, became a safe haven. 1992, Somalia. 1993 Bosnia, 1994 Rwanda. Now, really, only the 1991 safe haven in the KRG was successful. The other three safe havens were disasters for security, for personal physical security of people. So simply saying safe haven and using and saying we are going to Washington, D.C. and our cause is to request a safe haven, again, خدنا خاطرايتي وبيتها تخمون الباسط أمتو باي عامر تيو لهمزومة من ناشمة باي سيف هيبن أيدوسي لا. For a lobbying organization, for an activist organization that says we are going to Washington, D.C., we are meeting with members of Congress, we are meeting with the State Department, we are going to the United Nations, you need to be specific. When you say safe haven, tell us the detail. What is it that you're requesting? Because if you only go by the term safe haven, 75% of the time, 1991, 92, 93, 94, 75% of the time, it actually hurt the people instead of protected them. So I look at, what's happening in terms of this issue in Iraq, and I say, look, let's use Sinjar as a lesson, okay? Today, Sinjar is liberated, but now it's with Pesh completely having almost absorbed it. We don't know what its full status will be, but today it looks like part of the territorial expansion of the Kurdistan regional government. Jabar Yawar, the head of the Peshmerga, the head of the Peshmerga, when ISIS and this whole crisis unfolded, he said, ISIS has given the KRG, Kurdish nationalism, in 2 weeks, what 8 years the government of Iraq, what they couldn't get from 8 years with the government of Iraq. And there we see with Sinjar and others. And we have to ask ourselves, in the name of a safe haven of liberation, through this legislation that's coming in Washington, D.C., and this agenda that's being pushed by some in Washington, D.C., are we going to have Jabar Yawar saying the same thing about Dasht Ninwe? The Peshmerga commander saying the same thing about Dasht Ninwe. So, for example, in the research that I do, the work that I do with the community as an activist, we talk about safe haven. Yes, we support a safe haven. But the specific policy is called International Protection Zone. And what does this policy of International Protection Zone entail? This is one policy, it's specific because we are pushing it. So for example, it says the force going in to liberate Dasht Ninwe and create the safe haven in the technical name of International Protection Zone includes international forces. It includes an amalgam of Iraqi forces, but it also includes local, legitimate, independent Assyrian forces, Yazidi forces, and other relevant communities drawn from the people of the area to be part of that forces. It says international forces combined with local, legitimate, independent security forces from our community will be part of the border, will be part of securing the area and a border. It also says that these forces will be part of the permanent security force once the International Protection Zone is no longer needed and Dasht Ninwe becomes Dasht Ninwe again. So that it is not other forces, Nukhraya of the Peshmerga, who we no longer trust because they disarmed us and abandoned us. We can't trust them again. So it's we who have to secure it. That's part of the policy. But there are two other steps to this policy of an International Protection Zone as it's being articulated. And one of them is that the Ninwe Plains, once the IPZ is done, it transitions back to the Ninwe Plain. The Ninwe Plain must resume the process initiated in January of 2014 to become a province without annexation by the KRG. Today, the KRG wants to annex Dasht Ninwe, whether it's in the name of a safe haven, whether it's in the name of liberation. The KRG wants to conquer Dasht Ninwe. We want it to be a province after the IPZ, before that happens, before that can ever happen. And at the same time, it says, because there's Sinjar and Tal Afar, who are experiencing as communities, Shabaks, Turkmen, Yazidis, and others who are experiencing this dynamic, that this IPZ can include others for these communities to be preserved as well. We care about them very much. And that the Ninwe Plains, Tal Afar, and Sinjar can explore becoming a region before there's any summary annexation. Now that's an IPZ. There's a specific policy. Shimmo kulanait ila safe haven, dus. In a Dukhprasha International Protection Zone, to say that we have a specific vision, a specific policy that we're pushing. When somebody says safe haven, without telling you what they mean in any detail, you have to become very suspicious. You have to say, well, are you really just going to sit in front of Congressman Fortenberry or sit in front of the President of the United States and say safe haven without a plan, without having detail? That's nonsense. Of course there's a plan, of course there's a detail, so why isn't it being shared with everyone, right? So, and let me just say one more thing about saying IPZ. When we say International Protection Zone, we're creating a new name because it's a new idea, it's a new type of plan that hasn't been experienced before in the international community. And so, of course, something that's new has a name that distinguishes it from what existed in the past. Again, we say about just saying safe haven to those, again, not the general public, but to those who are advocating, we say, don't just tell us safe haven, tell us the detail. What does your safe haven look like? What is the political agenda, the security agenda, and the humanitarian agenda behind it? And what is the future of it transitions after being a safe haven?
Michael, أبصلت كت أخنا بغزاي وخ resolution 75 إلى أبصل recipe كانت دشت الننوي بيشا بليتا بيشا خشتا من ايدا من ايد كل لايا خبراونس كجانو كد بخيلت جانو بشتا توما اها بغزايو وخ اخنن اخا ريسبي كد روبا خربلا ك دشت الننوي كد خايوما اويا براونس كجانو كد اويا تانخ independent اخ تانخ جربيا كد ايلا اوديو مايكل أبد روبا باسيما ككل دنا explanations ككل دنا information كد يا بيت اتلوخ خبران خراي ان اتلوخ بقار خراي قد اتلوخ concern من ديانا خينا قد ال يعني إينا الأمت ديان صيرة شركة
By eminent, zooming back from just talking about Resolution 75, we need to understand as a community, as the Assyrian community, and this is what I presented at convention. For anyone who's interested, you can go on ANVSAT's YouTube website and watch the presentations at convention, especially of Dr. Helen Malko and Mardine Isaac, who presented with me on a keynote panel there on 100 years of genocide. The message that I want to give in this is the same as there, which is the reason why we're actually being harmed by legislation. We find ourselves in a situation where we're advocating and lobbying, and it's actually producing bad legislation, and we continue to follow it, and that we're being exploited, is because we're not helping ourselves. The Assyrian cause, the Assyrian people have not pursued meaningfully a strategy of Assyrians for Assyrians, who convention was Ganan Kaganan. For 100 years, we have been pursuing a policy of going to the League of Nations, going to the United Nations. Whether it's America or England or France, to save us and to bring us our rights. This model has failed us, and has failed us deeply. So, aya model at Ganan Kaganan, we have to internalize it. Until we help ourselves, no one else will help us. And until we realize that for 100 years we've been pursuing a flawed model as the Assyrian cause, we will continue to suffer. And let me say this very clearly. Our enemies of both kinds, those who attack us for our religion and those who persecute us for our ethnic agenda, our ethnic rights and our indigenous rights, they would prefer us to be on our knees, begging in Washington, begging in Geneva, begging at the European Union, instead of standing up and fighting, instead of pursuing Ganan Kaganan, because that's the road to where we reassert ourselves as a community. The other thing that I would say is, in terms of what's happening in Washington, D.C., and the problems that I raised about the groups that are working in Washington, D.C., it's very simple to resolve it. I think it's very simple to resolve it. Whether you're a member of one of these organizations that's working in Washington, D.C., whether you're an activist that supports a specific organization working in Washington, D.C., or the European Union, or in the United Nations, or whether you're just part of the Assyrian general public and you care about this cause and you support those who are working, there's three questions that you need to ask. You need to ask of those who are working in Washington, D.C. The first one is, what is your plan? Not safe haven, not province, these are easy humanitarian assistance and relief. No, everybody is asking for that. Nobody is not asking for that. Present the details, present the specifics. Don't hide your politics, because there's politics behind all of this. Don't be shy, be transparent. That's the first question that you have to demand an answer for. We need to demand answers from our organizations on this. Number two, what legislation are you proposing? What legislation did you propose? What legislation passed? And what legislation failed? Today, we have organizations that are working in Washington, D.C., who technically, because they don't report everything, because they're not transparent, they have a 100% success rate, because we only hear about the legislation that passes. No one has the 100% success rate, right? That's ridiculous, but it's because there's no transparency that's what they can present. We need to ask what legislation is being proposed, what failed, what succeeded. And the final and most important question we can ask to help fix the problems of our advocacy so that we don't get things like House Resolution, Concurrent Resolution 75, is for all the lobbying, for all the legislation, okay, what has been the effects, what have been the results on the ground? How has it benefited our people in Iraq, in Syria, and the Middle East? There are answers to questions that we should not accept. So when somebody asks an activist or a lobbyist, you pass certain legislation, what happens next? What happens in Iraq or what happens in Syria? If that lobbyist or that activist says, well, that's for the Iraqis to decide, or that's for those people over there to decide, everybody at home should say, oh no, we have a serious problem here. They're either lying to us, deceiving us, or they're just not being fully honest with us. But that's an unacceptable answer. The Iraq Sustainable Democracy Project, the Syrian American National Coalition, I can speak. ISDP, I was the project director of. The Syrian American National Coalition was a lobbying organization, but one that used a lot of our policy and advocacy work. Actually stopped working at the end of 2011 when we did a full study and fully recognized that legislation was hurting us and that the United States government had no intention of supporting us in the way that we needed, at the level that we needed, and in a way that actually empowered our community and gave us a future. In fact, the United States government demonstrated it was intent on pursuing those policies that did the exact opposite and hurt us. And so we stopped. And that was actually a very principled and responsible decision. Those organizations who are working today need to show that the legislation that they are passing, every one of them who says we've passed legislation, needs to say, and here has been the effect in Iraq, and here has been the benefit to our people in Syria. And if they cannot, they need to explain what they're doing about it, and they need to explain how they're adapting to that.
Michael, I would rob Basima. Hopefully, خينا بتاعت جدان خرز خچه بوش مطانویات یابد خچه بوش زوده information یابد و خچه بوش اوی کریه informations که امسخ بوش absorb او داخلون بوش برمیاخلون عبد رو بسیمه که کل دادانوخ بداین تام درنگی لعدیه بخشم قربت ستری سروای تام کسلوخون بخلطن که دانو أخذ دادان شکیلالن خچه درنگ next time جربك بوش جلده وداخل الشغل
أنا طالب بخلطة بتشيلتن وبسبارة خدخة معلومات خدخة مضانونيات الدا قصة إنا نيشدي إلى قد إن كشقيتن كل program أنا قد خزيلة كله now have the ability to start asking the right questions and making a decision about what to do next. Can I just say one last thing?
Sure.
أنا رابع إيميلز قبل من خورواتي من أمتناية من activists بس الشكل دي الدا بانر قد A&B سات متيلة مارنا بوست doesn't look very good. It looks very bad, looks very depressed. I just want to tell all the people who are watching that picture is me at the United Nations Human Rights Council, and that's the face of an Assyrian Umtanaya listening to the international community and the powers of the international community say that they're not going to help us. So if you want to understand why I look so depressed in that picture, is because that was the powers of the United Nations saying that they're not going to recognize genocide and that they're not going to help Assyrians the way that they needed.
Basima Roba Aziza Aten Abed, Roba Abed Basima.
Basima Roba Kada Perset.
Okay. Push Bishlama. Push up Shana. Firas Roba هم زملان خدشة من بريش دوكانه باید خا مجتانی بريك شكلك داتت ين أتندا شرشيد
لا بكل خادوته أنا أي أول نقطة رابعة أنا قائلة من 5 episodes
بس الخا من يختصرت أزر ودرخ بنومتن مخبة أدي خا من يختار بكشيت بشكلك وبدرخ أموخون كتخنا إن خيك ما خبران بوش برمية خوي دالر كت خدش بوش أبغى explain بيدا موي دالر مغبة خينا بتاعي وأخ أموخوني وغادية أنا من أخوني بأمتا ميقرأ في راس جتو خينا بتاعتك كت همزم خزخ بدايا خيك مدانات خيك ما همزميات وعينا قد دزويتا لمسخ بشرخلو لمسخ سباي ان دايجست او دخلو مجرك تاني ادي خچ مويدال انا واتن الدا قصه خچ همزمخ قد مويلا legislations بتاعنا لغ بداية حكمة منه بمود أورخة بتاعنا خجيش جوخاخ جا قواميات تقوملون رابا هسناي شولوا سباي خزخ آتوراي من بدفات الرقلون دزويتا يزيدية بختاتش كيلون لبليلون مت من ديانا فيدلون بريشة قد جتشقيتا دزويتا رابا خدجة تبيقنا أدخل من ديانا أخجي كيفية حكمة أدخل شولان كودي مت قواميات تيلون بريجدان وهات سورة أخ آتوراي أخ يزيداية يعني أنخين قد دزويتا رابا دامج بيلون أخ تجيبا وآدية جينوسايد بتاينا برتولونا الخا جيبخينا قد آمن جينوسايد ليلفيا الداني إن شمت جينوسايد بتايلا قمت كل شمت قرداية تاما قد قرداية عادية تاما اتلون حكمة واتلون سيكوريتي واتلون سيف هيفن كجاني دخت أمريكاية نو فلاي زون يوفلون قاتل كل خامن دي قاتل يوفلون مشيد اتشيخا بخزاي وقت عادي ريزولوشن تيتلا لاكت كديا سيبو ده خينا تيتلاكت ك شوابن هايرا يعني كدام كد إينا خيلانه بوش خيلا يبقاته ريزولوشن بتاعي كدام كد لتلون خيلا بوش خيلا مبصريله إذا ميقرأ فيروز تخمن تخ مجرد
رابط دوست ميقرانينوس يعني جار ابني أمتان أنا بشغال يطرانا منه يعني كد من دي توايلا بخزانة دخ أول من دي ما شغل يطرانا منه يعني لا ايسس اتخود له اوكي داخي ماس مبلخلق يطرانا ومبلوخونا واني بدزوتا قلت له امصيتا قلت له من كد جيبه من يانت ناشا من زوزا جيبه شادورنا بشامن امرخ قد خك من مبني امتن بتاعنا هل واشنطن من أطرة العراق بتاعنا مرنا جاي خيريتنا ناشت إيتخ منه بتاعنا من تمام مرة جاي خيريتون ده خيريتنا يويتون شكا يويتون شكا يقورا قرداية قد آني سنديلا وقد خرريلو أراتا أخشي بغزاخ مويلا جو سنجار جو خررت السنجار أو يزيدية مسكينة بلشلو أما أمت قردايش قيلالو وإذا وخا بيضخ زيلو خنا فيديو بيضخ رابا قرتت يزيدية بايمتيلو مش مرقل مرو
نو
كليامون أيش قولنا أي هدية
دياني رو وخلخها وإدياني
أيوة مخمود خيرا يقرأ مايكل أو مدبرانة قوشنت مش مرقل مرة أسراشنا أخني من دي تلمسلن أو دخل من حكومة العراق هدية بترشنا أيسس قمي ويلاقاتن أنا خشونها رابا نيشة إلى قد دكان دشت نينوى بيشي شقيلة وبيشي زوطنة وهذه خسامة من كردستان ريجن هل بات بنومتن يعني بزوتا يطن أنا بضاين خكمة من نوخن مارنا أخني قمت أهولي وخدية أزخ بلشخ من قرداية لأن آيسس أراتن شقيلنا موتن همزوم أزخ ليخ مارا أزخ بلشخ من قرداية بنومتن resolution مارلا قدوال genocide او قمشاري لا resolution خناش سبايله كان رسم سبايله لتلخني شيخ شتي انا lobbyist groups من بني امتن او من قردايه او من خرايه تبيشه مبلخه قد او من دي بالط رابس ما مارا او دنا لا بخزاي اوبام دقيقوتا مخدنا امتن خك من بقراين سباي genocide شور سندخله وادلو او من دي اخنا وليتن إلى قد منهرخ له من دي بخلطة أول من دي أخني تسجورخ منه أخشي أنا ناشلنا victims أخني إيوخ victims بلطيات دي قضاطيت رابط أرخات بريشة من سنتا اقنوماتا هدية اندشت نوع بيشا خررتا بربستا هويا خزيلو خنسنجار مودينا ويدا بيو بويلا بناتا خارخيتا resolution ليخ در قولو أخشي شخلاف كيكاتي لقيتو
شخلاف الرو بجورة
دوس
يعني قمت كل جري هر أنت كت مارنا الله جينوسايد فيتلا قردايا جري مودي تاما جينوسايد كت فيدونا against ديان هل أوديو خا مخلطة لنا طليبة هيج شمت سمقو شختانا برناشا متونا جو كتاب التشقيت داني قد مر بنيامن شمون ديا قطيلنا بريمنا موينا فيدي هلم اتلون شتوهرتا بيو دخ انا كمسن اديا ريزولوشن قد مغزو الى جنسايتي تلا القردايا الى جوك يعني الى دزويتا خامندي سيريس الى قد اخنا جري من كتخد بيايل سنتا ابدلا جري بقرا منه جحكت بجانو يم جحكت بديان بجحكلا انا لم بخشى ان ريزولوشن جري باس او يعني الى قصه الجينوسايد الى تيتا الاتوراي تيتا اليزيديه لا الخينه ادي اخنا جاكي جري برزو ديا وقداني قد شمت دو كلبت قد الاها بريوله و ساطانا كم سخشمو متخله آون جو تشقيتا جو كتاب التشقيتا كتبنا إلى خدنا مهديانة جبارة قاطينة قرداية
دوس هل بات ميقرنينوس ليه ما صار كله كتران شارخ له بقى ريزولوشن يعني ليه ما صار كله أن كترة جو تشقيتا ما تخلو لخا من هذا جيك أو دخل بخورخا بشطة قد أتيل إيتوتا أتيل شخلابة إن مزيدة نغزخينا بخشان رابا زهمت هويا أخشي بهالسنايوتا أمرخ تيمون هدية مدخورة أن victims أوكي يزيديز Assyrians قمولة مدخورة أوكي مزيدون Assyrians لخا أم يزيديز أخشانا قرداية لنا here's the statement من ISIS do the statement Kurdish media لنا أني genocide victims ليك genocide دار قلت قرداية أول من دي جاك يطخل أي يشقولون أن تريطلع خبرانة أخني رابا هازر قد سندخله أو من دي وبنيوتن من خجيبة خكمة هلبت مايكل ونينوس لنا رابا يعني ويانا هشة قد لهم زمخل شو تاسديا سب دزوتا بهدية بيو خضانة يقوتها ليبا أم أوضالها ولن دوراشة وكترة أخشيك يطيتون من خجيبة من بخزاينة قد وارغو أمقا أنشو تاسنيا lobbying groups مرة قموة خبرة لخا مرة يطمو إن لت مخوبة منشي باسو دور الشولو خيوتو أخني وادخو شولو بي طاشيلة منن يعني من خجيبة ليه بي أو دخله مش أسقى كترة واليتا ديان إيلا قد هيرخلو بني تنتاما بي هيارتان ها أني ماغنا قاتنا همنون الله ليه بي متخنش معنا أنا برخشن تاما وبرخشن بيتاين معنا بي خيارتوخن أو من ديبوش خلانا إتلن إديوم إلى أختوخن علىها ممطيا قاتن جو أن أطرواته أنا لن بخشاوة إلى باي تشانس إلى مخ evolution theory وجست تيلن لخا إتلن خا واجبوتا قد هاو قالقة أن ابن تنتينا تاما أن بيشانه بس أن ناشا بلاطنا جو أن ياماته وش مايتون أن كل بتت بغراقنا جو نارواته
شوى كلبت هذا مثل قدمة بإيمان
دوس
شوفوا من خابات ويتا كل خنقلون ياما مثلون
رابدوس
هذه
لخا إلى واجبوتن خامني صورة ماسخو دخله خكمة شو تاسب دزوتا شو تاسب ساكرامنتو سان هوزي فيدريشن أمريكا أريزونا وبخشام خينا لن بتخاروا مضينا قد أخني إتلن بسنادو خومندي conditional approval قد أول مندي هاو شخلبيتنا صندخلة أو مندي وبنيومتن لخا شويتن لتلن خيلة لخا إتلن خيلة أن congressmen وwomen الديان جو كتخا district جانو بضا ليباي أو دي sign ينسندي سندي الخا سبب إن يطي أن voters دي أن جو district ديو لنا سزقورة الله ليلة هذا خامندي أنا قايلة قاتي قد جاك سنديلة إن يطي ديستريكت ديو لنا منه خكتاوا من نوخن يعني شو تاسا ديوخن أمرتن قمولة باقورة resolution 75 كتوي أنا أمر يطيتمو أخن ليش لا بيخود خصاين سبب خكمة constituents دي لنا سزقورة بيو شمن لما تخله بلك التخمني أوكي أو دخله amendment وأتي الإيتوتا بخا amendment بجزوتا لا يطخ أي كمطيا ينهاوي له خيلة شيء خمندي صورة ماسخو دخله بطلبا من نوخن هاويتون بزو دا كشيرة الآمن دي قد أتيل شخلاب بخير تعالى
خينا جدا دانا أنا بياين أها برست شكلنا وترفن دزويتا همزمك بدا نشا أطورات ديان جدا خارت أي أتاك يو لوس أنجلس كانت فيلا تبقلا دزويتا أنا همزوم بجو طلمو 50 مليون برناشوت جو أمريكا أربسر جنات مياتنا قد خامنا إلى أطورات الديان قد أخنا دزويتا لمدة آتن اتلو خجا خبران قد تانيتا بليز آني شركة فعلوا من بني أمتا
يا بدزوتا أنا لنو بضاي هالمطيلي لخ برستا ومتانيتا هر صيتة برستا هر ستاف قميويلي مخبارتا مرابا مشمانتا يقرتا شمو بناتا بتبادل بريتا وقو أطرت إيران بشيتة اشتي أطشا يعني أربي اشتاشنا وعمرو مطيلة لخي وعمرو 18 سنة مطيلة قا أمريكا قورا بشيت أطشي شوا قو نيويورك سيتي اتوالا طلا يالا تري يالا وخبراتا مخلطة أسراشنا ترسرشنا وخمشة بغزايتون شكلو تاما أين إيوغو سان برناردينو هيلث ديبارتمنت أخ إنسبكتور بلاخي وغو هيلث ديبارتمنت بشي تريال بو إشتا شريلا تاما أين إيوغ خمن أن بيشق طيلة بأن أورزا وبختا مطانويات المطينة قالنا هل هدية إيوا أمرخ مسلمانة قشية هل بتقو طب لنا معروف من دي هالهدية أخشي مخبريات مطانة قد إيوا مسلمانة قشية لا يطخ دزوتا إما أخشي أدخل مخبرياته رابط شامخ يعني بدزوتا خمندي مخدان تلبي لأن يالو لنا يعني بغزايتهم كمان خلية مسكينة يما خشتلا شولا ولضر يعني على يطيد مت أهولتنا اتلن هيوي مريالها يولو خالة بأن ضانات بغزايتهم إلانة كريسماس بارة رابا مفشمان تالا بزوتا
ريشة بسمت جاوة أخنا من جيبت جانا وكل ستافد أيام بي وعلىها من يخلى
الآخر نقطة دين غير خلبت بني أمتن أول من دراب مبشمانة أخني لبن هماشة من كل بني أمتن تينا جو أطراين إينا جو مدن خاين إيكت إينا خمدي هلبت من وايلات خرابة قربة الله نرابة براشخ بيو أخشي خمدي تخرخله قط خمندي رابا قد يعني تخمني باسب أمقى نضانات خراية أنا يرخط أسرة تامنو جو جربية العراق وتبقلي وخشلي رابا من أن كامبس تأكي أن توتاوة ديان IDPs بخاينة خاكمة statistics شقلي قد مرنا من هدامة فلاخنة تاما أودة أن جوزت قناشاية مرنا من يانت من hospitals دشتت نينوى تري ألب هيال السورة باشي وبريا جو قيطة جو شيتا أدية إنا بجبا صورة من ترمة من تري ألب هيال السورة باري وبشيتا ويانا ترمة يعني أن ألبها وثمانية ما يال السورة ألبها وثمانية ما مبني أمتن تلبري له سبع أن أهوالته لو إلى برست environment قد آتي الإيتوتا يعني أوب من يانا الدين بصارة لا خاو تري وأسرة وإسري ألبا وثمانيما من تري ألبا وصل ترمى أي إلى خا جنخا قوم تم تزوتا إن إيوخ خا percent بيشخ جو population وألبا وثمانيما مقرومخ من يانا الدين قضاء إلى يعني مايت ألبا قموش المعنى يعني جارك هماش تخمنت أهولت أن ناشا جربخ هاي رخلو إن ويلا دشتن وهاي بخا أرخا يعني إن هاي يرتي أوبن إيكت إينا جو جربيا هاي بصباي إيكت إينا إتلي هيوي سنديتن بومندي كود أرخت ماسيتو
أنا إتلي هيوي قد بني أمتن بوش أمصر ريشا بوش أويا هايرانتا جوتخ منيات لا لخ تخمونه بتزويزة هايري أنا خلطة لا شقليلة أخجي بوش بالتي إذا أنت فايل أخ بايخ خا ريزولوشن باس أوي ين باس لابه بوش أوي بالخانة ألداها بوش باي برمي أبي باقور من شوتابياتا من تانا جبد إتلان ين شوتاسة إتلان طلبي مبرمتها قاته قد بوش أمسي يطي إيكا ومتدين ميكا بجواج لإيكا برشلة بدنا ريزولوشنز وآدية ريزولوشن قد إيلي خامندي دزويتا شارات تخورزة مريخاد ليلة خادرمان سباي قد دكتور يوو لقاتن أخنا أخلق له خادرمان لقد إن أخلق بلكي بغران رابا بوش الموت قربن هل باسم
هل بدهم زمن رابا يقولن رابا نغزة متخرم يقرا مايكل ونينوس بلكي تخاك من ديانا بجلدوتا لقم بارميت نصفا اخشي باين ما تخرنو خن خارخيتا باسه أن قواميات تويلو شي تتورى من أن ابن أمتن من دشتنو بلطلو خارخيتا هاقنا اي قصة طويلة تريشا بات اي by the way اتلن eyewitness report sign affidavit ويدانا قد أوى من دي وياله أوكي يعني كل خادوته إن خاجو حكمة أمر أوى من دي ليلة دوس رابط حسنيوتا يوخلو بروف تأمن دي أوكي قد ترشبات قمضانا تيلو بشمرجة مرو أخني خامخ لوخن هديليتن إراك ليلة لخا آيسس ديانا جو ننوى أخني خامخ لوخن زبطنو الأدشت ننوى تاما كله آني أخني we're in charge أوكي خارتا تيلو مرو تشكا ديوخن جاك يويتونو قامو سب أخني لا يطخ أخني خامخ لوخن قامو تنسني قد شكا من دي قمايا ومن دي تري إنوي لبلاشا من آيسس وأختوخن بغلطة ليتون تريند ليتون بضايا مو أوديتون وماخيتون الله أخني قا سيفتي ديان جاك أودخل أوشولا سو قانا تري سبابا جاك يويتونو كله متيلو فلايرز كود دكتك الأمرانة الدكانة كافي شوبس كود من دي فلايرز أو بأي فلايرز سامبلز أتلن منه أوكي هالبت إيوا ساين بسكيورتي تاما التأمريات أختوخن متيتون أخشي بشمرجة مرومتيتون إيكا كله تيلو البلارانة بتواتش قيلونا وبخنا شأنا بارسوبايت ويطلنا انترفيو مرة أكارل اتلا فارم خونة أوناشا مرة فارمري لا يخيجوا بقشة دية سو رقة ممديتا مرة أنا جاك هاويلي لخا ويبنس هماشا هاويلا إن كيس خمندي ويلا اتلن تشكت جانا مرلا جاك كله قم شقليلو قمتيلو جو خبنيانة حكمة إتاما بنيانة بخشان زروتا Ministry of زروتا تلو تاما قمتمتي وسيدز لن خطر جمودي بنيانة exactly يوسديو أخشي إيوة ministry تحكمة متيلو كل weapons قماليلو تاما وقمتيلو قم دوري لطارة خارطة بار كلها ومن دي ويدالو أو شولا بأن تريشباته قريلو قاشا فلان أخني دخ بلاطة بوشم شينا مرو ايكتون بلاطة خشون اختوخن هايريتون أخني بلاطة بخشان أبخ توخن بلطيتون بصباقات توخن بيتون خيتون بوشم شينا دورتون سو لا أخشي بلطلو قم وشقلو تشكا دين قد ما سخامخ يعني قد لا هولا برسا الشكل خمندي قد وصقو بانكس اتلو زوزة ماسي شازي شقليلو مندي اتلو جوباته هاولو خضانا أطليس يناني خاميلة جاني لا بلطلو اني جلي بلطلو أدخا اوكي ومن يتري كله أن تشكت دين ابن أمتن قمتيلو جو بنيانا إلى خابشكش وبا يب مبلخيتو إنه قداعش أوكي أنا ناشئ إديو يوما خكمة ابن أمتن برخشنا جو واشنطن مارا نقرأ كونغرسمان ستيت ديبارتمنت بريزيدنت أوباما بليز ويلا قتل أما اليزيديز وأخنن وقرداية أوكي يعني أي دقة بلخلة موت إتيقن هاويلا قد قبل خلة أو من دي
كده أنا بخشابن أنا أدخل خرزة إنا بوش بتخانة آينة بوش مبرمانة إن آبي أمتديا ليلة لبتا قد يلبا من دانا من دي أنا عادية أنا بخشابن أن خرز جري أبي جو AMB ينجو كل تي في ستيشنز قد أخنا إتلن أطوراي ينجو راديوي كومت إينا خكمة بدنا مديان همزة أنا دوزويتا بنخابن شمت خكمة ناشية من إتلون راديوي جو شيكاغو أريا قد ناشا شك من زبلة ليل خام دخينا بشماية منه بتيامنا باسد زبلة همزو منه يتفي باسدان الليجيسليشنز همزمي ملبيكا أمتا خكمة أرخات خجة من ديانة لكن خاتشا زويزة تالوقنا كردين الراديو ستيشن دزويتا أنا أخ مارت أيام بيدون لخا همزوما قد أزويزة قد جري آزل ك تيوي دي يعني كميديا يتجانن بريش لك نخراية إتا إنشمخ بس مين همزومة دزويتا ما بخيانت لليلة ما كريكانتا بتيامنا بس تخش من ديان قد دزويتا أوديو لخ سنيخ الشمخ خكمة دوناي دوراشت قد أصلا ماينا جمديتا أنا أدي تانا كبني شيكاغو أنا دزويتا هيفية من شيكاغو قطيون أصلا باين تبرت أيام بي من جو شيكاغو بارت مدي قطنا لمدا أنا ناشي مجرى من سيستم إتلون ليلة خامندي ليلة سلامت جو شيكاغو
بينو مرة خط لقيت نينوس أنا يطن جو شيكاغو 12 سباي هم
لي يطت ماني كلي الدرقويل ماني من ماني خورله خا سوسايتي لا دوزويتا مصديانتا
لا يطمو كدكتات إيتا منيانا جورك نأمتن إلى خد ديستريبيوشن أخ أبخني برناشخ إيتا ناش سباي إيتا ناش خبر لا أنا أمرت كله إينا سباي كله إينا ملا خلت كدكتا بريشات من هاوي منيانا جورا هاوي خا أسرة أمري خابوش خري وأخشي يط همن اللي هيويو جاري كاوي يقول شيكاغو إتنا شرابة سباي وتلي هيوي قد أنا شمانت إنا شيكاغو هم زميت من شو تاسة ديوخن أمريتون داخي أول مندي بشواقاتهم إن شو تاسة شادر كونغرس من ومن أمري أول مندي ريزولوشن لا أوديت سنديتون unless آتي شخلابة رابا يترانو ما سنوديتون تلي هيوي مانينا مسقدوخ
لا دزويتا شو تاسة قد شيكاغو إتن أنا بغزاين كت لينا كأمتا بالخانة
يطمو لي أي قمت خرالي بخمندي ميغرنيوز بك أوبات انتخرت له أنه طناتا جو قمت من إتوا حكمة خلانا جو إيراك جو إيران جو سوريا أو دي خمندي غلطة أو دي خطيت الناشديان أمريت إنه جو شيكاغو إيكت إيتن ديترويت من دي لا همزة مخل صدام خرت أعزل ما خيلة تاما لا شغلة بغزاي خو من دي يوم وايل هدي أزت الخكمة خرزت إتلن إيكت إينا شيكاغو ينخينا بلكن خكمة شمر أي إلى لا يطناش دخ بخايا ما أم قرداية لا بيخ مسقط لا مسقط دزوتا يعني ما تويخ إقارة قاله خشوخ إيتن برست قد هاوية جاستس تاما إن خشوخ لتشان يعني من آيسس ليه أزخ أمرخ آيسس قمو أراتن قم شغليتونو جاك مضريتونو قاتن أي ليلة فير سبيطخ آيسس لنا ناشا قد ناشا همزة مني أخش من قرداي إينا ناشا ماسخ شغل أطليس ماسخ دوراشا هاويلا أمي أو من دي ليلة دوس جاك جاروبنا أو دي ديموكراسي أي إلخا أرخد ديموكراسي بيكتوي كونستيتوشن أدية قد كردستان بيتون كونستيتوشن جاك حقويات بصريات خاميتونو جاك أو ديالوج هاوي وأرخد ديالوج إلى لي أمرخي من هدي أخني we're accelerating بجلدو تباي خاطر له خيل رابا جورا لا شوقنو لا كربي منا no أي إلى ضانت قد هاولا شقلتها ويا والتها فرماتها ين لتلن ضغطي تاما أمرخ رب خيدا وهدية ليلة ضانو هم من الله
بلا أنا جو شيكاغو أن شو تاسد بغزايبن كل ربطت جيامنا اتخناقة دزويتا لينا بالخانة كنيشة أصلاية أمتديا بزود سامزوديقة قرداي بالخانة أصلا يعني خشو البيرولينا وبالخانة قرداي أخامن دي لا جري جو خرزت داتيت الدامن دي همزمك قد خزخ أها بالخانة أبند إلى تانخ نخراي أبي بالخانة إنا بموت شما أخنن أخ أمتا جري قبل أخلون أخ حكمة ناشت قد بالخانة كنخراية ين بالخانة كنيشت أمتا دزويتا أنا بنخابن شمت شوتاسة أمتنايا متوينا ألدن شوتاس قتلنا بالخانة كأمتا روبا ما خبانا روبا أنا قلتلي خكمة همزمياتي أنا درمان
أي شوقنا نينو سنة اللي عندها قصة زوت
درمان شيكاغو في راس أخجي خامن ديله نينوس أنا جري أزن خدش دونا متن تاما خدش من كل خيال تشكلته خهمزمته خزخ أنه إن البيرولينا كد باي بلخي كنخراية مبتابة خوش بلخي كنخراية إنا بلخي كنخراية ومضي كدونا بلخانة كنخراية كيوتراند نخراية لا كدي من تمتي كد بلخانة غخنا كأمت أطوريتا إنا البيرول نخراية أي أخنا لنصح قبل أخلا جري straight up answer أبيلان كد أنا شو تاسن identify أبي أنا شو تاس كد دزويتا أوديو خويتونا شيكاغو أصلا هيش من دي لتن منه بياشا إما ألبا أطورا يخرو كل رقة من أبي 100 لتن أطورا يعني بشم أطورا لت
يطمو خك منه بدزوتا رابا بشيمنا رابا اللي بيقيشة بخزانة أنا قيوان دينو ستوايلة ابن أنتن تاما مخ ليه خشوي إتلن هيوي تاما من هذا روبي إذا وبخزانة شو تاسن وطوكاسن وقبن لنا بدزوتا وادا خمندي ما صدقات بيو خمندي إلى مجد الأرى سو قيشنا خدشة بن خجيبة أنا خسامة جورا منه وسامخينة مدخورة أدخى بدزوتا أنا هماشة جربن خزن أمري جلاس بلغو مليا لا بلغو سفيقة يطمو وخشتي وتاتي تاما أب أنا شو تاست إنا من خزت للبات خشراء أن إنا البيرول ين تأخذ من قرداية إن شمت تخمنتي أمرن موديلة تخمنتي لنسا صغورة منه أخشي أمرن موديلة أنا مارنا جو كردستان ريجن أنا مدبرانة KRG لنا خربناش مخبيلا هم من مخبيلا أخني أطراي يطي أخني صب يخناش سندان قاتي أخشي إذا تصير أنا سب إترابا أشيرت تجو قرداية إن مخزيرابا خبقات أن خينا ربي إذا أزي هاو من إسلاماية هاو من خينا وخينا من هذا خلينا وادو أوشولا أخشي لا بخلطة إن إيوت دبرانا إن إيوت ليدر إن مش قالت شولة خا أمتا تاما وريجن وبيت هاوي أطرا ايديالز غير خامتلو
وبداية أخنا صبي وأخنا سباي وأخ جري كالبر خاصا
جيك هاو ستاند يعني إن هماشا لا قال خاطرت أي خاطرت أشيرة شو خخلة من دي ليلة شرارة شاقل شوبا يعني خطيات واينا تاما جيك أش سيستم الديمقراطية دي خلنا وأخني إلى شولني إلى خلنا نخلق إنه هاولن بيخ إيتوتا هاولن تاما دزوتا
أنا ميغرفيروز أدي أجاه خيتا خدش دونا بين متن بوزو داك ناشط شيكاغو أزن خا شو تاسه كاميرا بيدن قد خزخ إيكا كلينا موديفادنا وأيدنتفاي أودي لجانه خا ترانه بدماغ خلون أدي هرجدا يرخد كد إلى دانت كريسماس إلى بالا شولانا في الخانة براباخلون أنا أكتشي جريات شيكاغو بمود جفلتا بشتلا جفلتا مود طينا مبلخنا جدا كالبيتش ده دكتور خينا بتايخ دانت براكتت خرزلا رابا أوديو أنا خينا كريبلي لا جري أما كريبا هنا خينا كريبلي تازتين من شيكاغو أنا أوديو ساعتت أسرة قيدة ديرم وعند الطيارة دزويتا التيو خجاء وتبلا كد أزخوا خنا بايلوت مرة خامندي خريب اللي جري مدرسة خلا أنا ني خونتا كملي رملي فلطلي قطارة مري أنا أدي جري أزن بخاخيتا ما تيمولي هرمتنون هم أربي دايق خينا تبلي خاخيتا وستريت سان فرانسيسكو من جيبت أتونا سان هوزي إنا خنا جداين خنا لا تبلي لم دمودي أخري خنا تيم و خدش دزويتا لبي مليلة من شو تاسد كد شيكاغو بالخانة وبجلدويتا تازن خينا قد أزن خدش مارن identify أبي يطخ إيكا كليت لأمتن وخالد أمتن إيكا قد أمسخ جو واشنطن قالن تاما ما دياخله كما راملي قالن كوبله بدنا ازجدت جبار قتلم
اللي هي تبقى بناشة صبية وبلكي تهاوي رابا هيرانا إيت الناشة في شيكاغو أنا رابط لي قاربية بدزوتا
خطرش من يبت
يون اسكيش من البيت
أبو باسيمة في راس تيلو أوديو بنوم المغبة خنا خرزة أوديو كمت مصيلا أمسخ خدشمات آنيات يلبخ بدا ريزولوشن شبي خمسة كت تيجي واشنطن بيايلو باس آفت وأبو باسيمة ميقرأ في راس وبخينا مرن أبو باسيمة ميقرأ مايكل يوش قد هو يراخ لي قدا قصة خينا أبيتون أبو باسيمة
باسيمة سينو
بوشو مشلا